Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today I want to show you how we can configure ArgoCD to use single sign-on with Entra ID to log in into the ArgoCD UI, but also into the ArgoCD CLI. So the plan for today is, first I'm going to create a new AKS cluster. I'm going to install the ArgoCD AKS Extension. The reason why I'm doing this is I want to focus on the single sign-on part, and with the ArgoCD AKS extension, it's just easier. If you have already ArgoCD running, I will provide the chapters down below, so you can just skip to the interesting parts. After we have set up the cluster, we're going to go to the Azure portal and create a new Entra ID app registration. And I will go through it step by step. So you will see it's actually quite simple, and you can just follow along and enter all the information needed. After this, we're going to test the single sign-on with two different users. So first we're going to use a normal user, which should only have read-only access. And then we're going to log in with the admin user. If everything works, then I'm going to show you in the end what steps you have to take if you're running the normal ArgoCD to also enable the single sign-on with Entra. As always, I will provide a link down below to my GitHub, where you can find all the code, all the snippets from today, but you can also scan the QR code on the screen. So when I talk about single sign-on, when you open the ArgoCD UI, after we have configured it, we will see on the right this new button that says Login via Azure. If you click on this button, then we can see that we now can log in with our Microsoft account. This means we can use the same account for ArgoCD as we're using for Azure and other Azure services. The best part about everything is it's actually quite simple. So let's switch over to the terminal and let's get started. All right, here in the terminal, let's define a couple variables. That's going to be the name of our resource group, the location, the name of our AKS cluster, and the tenant ID. We're going to need the tenant ID later, so let's put it in a variable right now. Next, we're going to create a resource group in which we're going to deploy our AKS cluster. Once this resource group is created, we can create our AKS cluster. As you can see, the creation of the cluster is quite simple. I use the resource group name, the name of the cluster, the location, and the last two parameters here are to enable the workload identity. We're going to use the workload identity so that the ArgoCD can check our credentials towards Entra ID and decide if we're allowed to log in or not, and also what permissions our user has. I also have a video on my channel explaining everything step by step, what workload identity is and how it works. So I will link the video in the description down below. As always, I also have the code of the demo, everything I showed today on GitHub, and the link for the GitHub repo will also be in the description down below. For now, creating the cluster will take between 5 and 10 minutes. I will stop the video, and once it's finished, we'll continue. The AKS cluster has been created. Now let's continue. So first, we're going to get the URL of our OIDC issue. OIDC stands for OpenID Connect, and it will be used for the communication between Entra to get the token. If you print the variable, you will see the URL is always quite similar. So we have the location here, then OIC brought AKS Azure. Then we have here the tenant ID, and the last part is a unique ID. We're also going to need this later so we can log in with our Entra user. Next, let's download the credentials so we can access our AKS cluster. And once this is done, we are going to create, actually, we don't have to create a new namespace. I just set the context to the namespace ArgoCD, because in the next step, we're going to create this namespace. And we are also going to do everything inside this namespace, so I don't have to type it all the time. Okay, now we're going to deploy ArgoCD using the AKS ArgoCD extension. So let's execute the code and then we'll see what we are doing. Since the biceps file, I only have to reference the biceps file itself and the resource group name, and the biceps file will deploy everything that's inside. So let's deploy this. The deployment will take around 10 minutes. And while this is running, let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and let's take a look at this file. All right, here in Visual Studio Code, we see the biceps file, and here we have everything configured to deploy the AKS ArgoCD extension. The reason why I'm not using the normal ArgoCD deployment is I want to keep it as simple as possible and just focus on the single sign-on integration. At the end of the video, I will show you how you can do everything in ArgoCD as well, but I thought it might be too much if you do ArgoCD and SSO because it's quite complicated if you have never used it. So let's keep it as simple as possible, and this extension does almost all the work for us. So we just have to fill in a couple variables. Right now, as you can see, there's still quite some placeholder. The reason is we first have to have ArgoCD running. Then we can change the ArgoCD server to be publicly available. This will give it a public IP address, and then we can use this IP address to configure the single sign-on. In your production cluster, you probably have an ingress, and then you can just configure the ingress to access ArgoCD. So you wouldn't have to do it twice, you could do it all at once. But again, since we keep it as simple as possible, I don't have an ingress, so I just use a public IP address, but first we have to get this IP address. Once we have this, we will register the application in Entra. Then we also get this Entra application client ID. And when we're done, we fill out the variables, and then we'll go through the file again and look at all the details, what's happening. For now, I'm going to stop the video and we will wait until the extension is installed, and then we'll continue. All right, the AKS ArgoCD extension has been installed, and we have one last step before we can configure the single sign-on. So let's clean up the terminal and let's take a look at the services ArgoCD provides. So we do a kubectl get service. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of services, and we can also see here they are all cluster IP. This means they're only accessible from inside the cluster. But when we want to log in with Entra, Entra needs a URL for the callback, and this has to be available publicly. That's also the reason why I said before, we first have to install ArgoCD and then we can configure it. So the last step before we can configure single sign-on is to make the ArgoCD service publicly available. If you're using a cloud provider like I use AKS, then we can just change the service to load balancer, and then Microsoft, or Azure in this case, will give us a public IP, and then we can use this public IP for the callback address. To do this, I have prepared a YAML file. Let's apply this YAML file and then we take a look at it. So I just do a kubectl patch on the service named ArgoCD server. This has been applied. Now let's take a look at the YAML file. As you can see, the YAML file is as simple as it can be. All I do is I change the spec type to load balancer. So now if we go back to the terminal, we should see that our service is not cluster IP anymore. It is load balancer, and it will also have a public IP address. Back in the terminal, if we do again a kubectl get service, then we can see here we have now one with load balancer for the ArgoCD server, and we also have down here an IP address. So I'm going to copy this IP address, put it in my notes on the side because we're going to need it later. And before we switch over to the Azure portal, let's also print again our OIDC issuer, because we're going to need this one. So I'm also going to copy it from my notes, and we're also going to need the tenant ID. So I'm also going to copy this one. And with this in place, let's switch over to the Azure portal and register our application. Here in the Azure portal, let's now register our application. And this is topic, this was always very complicated and I didn't understand, and it was like almost fearful to use it. But once you understand it, it's actually quite simple. And I want to show you today a step-by-step instruction how to configure it. So you will see it's actually not that complicated. To do this, we have to open Microsoft Entra ID. So I have it up here, but I also have it on the left. And if you don't have it, you can just search for it for Microsoft Entra ID and open it. Now we scroll down a little bit and there we have app registrations. And here we click on new registration to create a new app registration. Now we provide a name, for example, ArgoCD. And if we scroll down, we have here the redirect URI. This is used after you logged in successfully. This URL will be called, or you will be redirected to it, so you can just continue your workflow. This means this is the URL of our application. In our case, the ArgoCD UI. So as a platform, we're going to use web. Since it's a web application, then we provide the URL. So that's HTTPS, then the IP address of the external service /auth/callback. So let's paste in the URL we copied before, the IP address, I mean. And here, if you have an ingress configured with a DNS, then you would obviously use your DNS and your own domain. For now, that's good enough. Let's register it. Should only take a second. And now we can configure it. But before we do so, we're going to copy this application ID. That's the client ID, which we are going to need later to configure ArgoCD. So let's paste this in my notes. And now let's go step by step through the options we have. So first we're going to authentication. And here you can see we have our redirect URI and we're going to add a new one. So we click on add platform, but this time we're using mobile and desktop applications. Then we leave everything as it is. And this time the callback or the redirect URL will be localhost 8085/auth/callback. This is needed if you want to use the CLI of ArgoCD, because localhost 8085 is the URL of the CLI. And if you add it there, you can also use the CLI and single sign-on. So we add it here. Then we go to the certificates. Here you have two options. You can either use a client secret. The problem is the client secret is a password. It can expire. You have to manage it. It's quite complicated. So the better solution would be to use federated credentials. In this case, Microsoft or Azure uses managed identities, and therefore there are no passwords or secrets you have to manage. So we're going to add credentials. Then for the scenario, we select Kubernetes accessing Azure resources, because our application is running in Kubernetes and we want to access Entra ID. Then here we have to provide the cluster issuer URL. That's the OIDC issuer URL we copied before. So we paste it here. Then the namespace where ArgoCD is installed, that's ArgoCD. Then the service account the ArgoCD server is using. By default, the name is ArgoCD server. But let's quickly switch over to the terminal and check that's correct. So here in the terminal, let's clean this up, and then we do a kubectl get service account. Now we get all the service accounts from the ArgoCD namespace. And here we have the ArgoCD server service account. So we use the right name. So let's switch back to the Azure portal and let's continue. Back in the Azure portal, we scroll down a bit and we have to provide a name. So I use ArgoCD credentials. And then we can add this. Next, we're going to token configuration. Here we add groups claim. And we select the last option, groups assigned to the application. This will allow us to assign groups to our application, and then everyone inside this group can access our application, meaning ArgoCD. So we add this. The last configuration we have is the API permission. Again, one further down. And here we can already see the default permission is here from the Microsoft Graph user.read. This means by default, our application is allowed to read the users, but an administrator has to give consent. You can see here I'm an admin, and therefore I can give the consent here. If no admin gives the consent and a user logs in for the first time, then they will get a message being asked to request consent from the admin, and then they have to wait until an admin gives consent. So we give this now. We are sure we want to give it. And now we can see here the status is granted. This is everything we have to configure for our app registration. Now we can add users. So we go one back in Microsoft Entra. Here we have our enterprise applications. If we click on this, we can see here now an enterprise application with the same name as the app we just registered. In our case, that's ArgoCD. If we open this, then we can see on the left side the users and the group. So if we click on this, we can see here my user is added by default because I'm the creator, but you can also click on add user and group and add more users or group. What's important, if you're using the Entra free plan, you are not allowed to add groups. So you can only add users. Only if you have a paid license, then you can also add groups. For now, I'm just a user. So this is everything we need to test. Now let's go back to our ArgoCD configuration and configure ArgoCD with all the information we just provided to Entra. Back in Visual Studio Code, we have here our ArgoCD extension, the biceps file, and now we can fill out the placeholder we left before. So first, I'm going to paste the Entra app client ID. That's the client ID we copied from the app registration. So we have to paste it twice. Then I'm going to paste the tenant ID one line above. And lastly, we are going to paste our public IP address. So now we have all of this configured. Then here it gives some information in this section to ArgoCD, for example, to use the workload identity. Then also what scopes we want to use. In this case, the profile, the email address, so you can see it later in the ArgoCD UI. If you scroll down a bit further, I've here already pre-configured a couple permissions. So you can see here the default policy provides a role read-only. This means if a user is not configured but is added to the app registration, then this user will get the read-only permission. We will see this because my user has been added to the app registration, but I'm not going to assign any role to my user. This means my user will only have read-only. All the way down here, we have to provide here either an Entra user email or the ID of a group. And this user or group will be given the role, the org admin role. What's important, in the Microsoft documentation, it says user ID or group ID, and I was not able to get it work with a user ID. So after I'm finished recording this video, I will open a pull request and ask the team for clarification. But in my case, only the email address works for user. And it's also important that this email address is case sensitive. So I'm going to add a user. I have a user called demo.user@programmingwithwolfgang.com. And what I often like is to have the first letters in uppercase, so it's easier for me to read. But if I do this, then it won't work because my user has the email address, everything in lowercase. So that's very important to remember. And it cost me, I think, 2 or 3 hours to figure out why it's not working. Okay, so now we have configured that my user will be assigned this read-only rule because I haven't given any role assignments. And the demo user will be given the org admin user. And above this, we can see all the permissions this org admin role has. So I just copied this from the ArgoCD documentation, but what this user is allowed to do everything with applications. We can create, update, delete, and get repositories. As well, we can get all the clusters. And with this, you can configure what permissions your user should have. But for now, let's keep it this way. I think it's already complicated enough. So it's important. The demo user is the admin and my user is just the reader. Now we scroll down a bit further. This line is just to reference our AKS cluster, so we can reference it later, actually here. And the last section is to install the ArgoCD extension itself. So there's nothing special about it, so we just say it's the Microsoft ArgoCD extension and the version. And probably the most interesting part is down here, the configuration. This is also the reason why I decided to use the extension over the normal ArgoCD. So I just provide some information here and the extension puts it in the right places. And if you have ArgoCD, you have to put them yourself in the right places. At the end, we're going to take a look where these are. But here you can already see we have a couple different config maps. We have here a label and annotation. So it's quite some work and you have to know where it is. For now, we just fill in the placeholder and then we're good to go. So I'm going to save this file. We switch over to the terminal and deploy it again. Back in the terminal, we do the same command as before, the AC deployment group create. We provide again our resource group and the file name. That's the one file we just looked at. Going to deploy this, it's going to take again around 10 minutes. Once it's finished, we're going to take a look if everything works as expected. And we're also going to test the admin user and the read-only user. The ArgoCD extension has been updated. Now we can test if everything works. So let's switch over to the browser and let's test it. Here in the browser, I hope you can see it. Let's zoom in a bit. I opened the public IP address and you get this warning because we don't have a certificate installed. Again, in your production cluster, you're probably using an ingress and there you have your certificates, so you shouldn't get these warnings. For now, let's just continue to the site. And here we can already see the first change. So let's zoom in a bit. Here we now have this button, login via Azure. Even though we didn't have to change anything, we just provided all the information and then ArgoCD shows this button by itself. So now let's test if everything works. Click on it. Now I have to log in with my Microsoft user. So I'm just going to paste my user. Then I'm going to provide my password. And I'm also going to provide the multi-factor. This has been approved. We want to stay logged in for now. And we can see we are logged in now. If we click on the left side onto user info, there we can see that my user is my email address. And as group, it shows my email because I'm not part of a group. But if a user is part of a group, then you should see that as well. Now let's test if we can create an application. If you remember, I said before, my user is part of the enterprise application, but I didn't assign a role. This means by default, my user got a read-only role. So if we create an application, we should get an error message. To deploy an application, let's click on Applications, then on the top, New App. There we provide a demo name, for example, My App. We select the default project. Then I just configure the basics. I like to enable auto-create namespace and prune last. If we scroll further down, I provide the URL. So I'm going to deploy a Bitnami Helm chart because they have a wide range of different Helm charts, and it's super easy because I can just click here on the list and select whatever I want. So I like to do Redis or Nginx for my tests, and I also select the newest version. We scroll a bit further down, we have to provide the destination, that's our own cluster, and the namespace where ArgoCD is installed. If we scroll further down, we have some information about the directory, but if you know ArgoCD, then you will already see that we don't have a field to change the values of the values.yaml file. So this is already an indication that my user doesn't have the permissions. We will see later with the admin user that it will appear. But for now, it's not there. And if I click on create, I get an error message and it says here, permission denied. This means my user doesn't have the permissions, which is actually everything we wanted. My user is only read-only, and so they can't deploy anything. Now let's log out and let's try to log in with the demo user. This demo user is the admin, and this user should be able to create everything. Let's click again on login via Azure. I'm going to provide the email I configured in the ArgoCD extension. So this was the demo user at programmingwithwolfgang.com. Then we provide the password and we sign in. We also stay signed in. And this also worked, even though we didn't add this user to the enterprise application. But it works because the user was added in the ArgoCD configuration. So if you click on the user info, we can see here the username is demo.user. So we are logged in with a different user. If we now go to the applications, to new app, and now let's try to deploy our Helm chart. So as the name, let's just use app. Project name is default. I'm going to configure the same as before. So the sync policy is going to be automatic. I enable prune last and auto create namespace. Then if we scroll down a little bit, I provide the same URL. Say it's a Helm chart. Then I'm going to select again the Redis and also the last version. Then again, our own Kubernetes namespace, Kubernetes cluster, and the ArgoCD namespace. Now you can see we have here loading. That's something we didn't have before. If we scroll further down, suddenly we have this Helm section. And here we can override the values of the values.yaml file. That's something we didn't have before. So this is already a good sign. If we click on create, it should now work. It takes a couple seconds now, and then our project or application should be created. There we have it. It has been created. It's syncing right now. If we click on it, we can already see a whole bunch of applications have been already created, and some, as this one over here, is still being created. If we wait now 1 or 2 minutes, we will see that everything is running, but we have already seen that my user now had the permissions to create a new application. This shows we had 2 different users, 2 different permissions, and we could sign in with our Entra single sign-on. Now let's switch back to the terminal and I'm going to show you what you have to configure if you're using ArgoCD and not the extension. Back in the terminal, let's clean up this, and then we're going to do a kubectl get pods. This gives us all the pods running in our ArgoCD namespace. And here we are interested into the ArgoCD server pods. So in my case, these are 2 pods, but if you're running a high available setup, you might have more. Here I'm going to copy the name of the first one, and we're going to take a look at the labels of this pod. So let's clean this up, and then we do a kubectl get pod, the name of the ArgoCD server pod, and then we provide the show labels parameter. It's a bit hard to read, but here we can see we have the Azure workload identity use equals to true label. If you remember, this is exactly what we had in the AKS ArgoCD extension. This is also a part of the Entra workload identity. So again, if you've never heard about it, I would suggest you go back to the video. I will link it down below, and there you understand how it works. So very simplified, Entra workload identity gives every pod inside an AKS cluster an identity, and then the pod can use this identity to access other Azure services. Therefore, you don't need a password or a secret. So that's the AKS equivalent to managed identities we already have in Azure. Since I'm using the AKS ArgoCD extension, this label has been set automatically. If you're using ArgoCD without the extension, then you have to add this label yourself. And you also have to consider if a pod gets restarted, the label will be removed. So you should add the label to the deployment. Then the next thing we have to configure is the service account. That's the ArgoCD service account, ArgoCD server service account. That's the one we used as our credentials. If we take a look at the annotations, we can see here we have this Azure Workload Identity Client ID annotation. And this client ID is the one we copied from our app registration. So again, the extension added it automatically. If you're using ArgoCD without the extension, you have to add this annotation yourself. To do this, it's quite simple for the pod. So for the pod, you do a kubectl label pod, then the name of the pod, and then the label. So in this case, you would replace the free access with the ending of the name, because every pod has a different name. Then you can apply the label. And for the service account, you would do a kubectl annotate service account, then again the name of the service account, and the annotation you want to add. Obviously, you have to replace this placeholder, the app client ID, with the one we copied from the app registration. Okay, so now we have configured our pods, we have configured our service account. Now we have to configure our config maps. And there are 2 different config maps we have to update. So let's first print them out, and then I will show you what you have to change. So we do a kubectl get config map. Then the first one is the ArgoCD-CM, and we print it as YAML so you can easily read it. Now we get quite a wall of text, but if we scroll all the way up, then we can see here the first section. We have the OIDC config. If you remember the values we added, so we have here my tenant ID, we have here the ID of the app registration, and all the other items we added. For example, I said that we provide the scopes for the email and the groups, so we can use them and show them in the ArgoCD UI. So you have to add this entire section to the config. And if we scroll down almost all the way to the bottom, we can have here the URL. By default, this has a placeholder, and you have to replace it with either your URL to your ingress, your DNS entry, or just the public IP address like I did here. Let's clean this up, and now we're going to take a look at the second config map. This time we're using the ArgoCD RBAC CM. We're also going to print it as YAML. We again get quite some text. If you scroll up a bit, there we can already see the policy.csv. So if you remember, we added here the email address of the demo user. We added here the policy default to the role read only. And I also added here the email to the scopes. If you scroll down a little bit, I think that's everything. Yes. So that's everything that has changed in this config map. And that's it. So you have to add the labels to the pods, the annotation to the service account. You have to update the ArgoCD CM config map and the ArgoCD RBAC CM. Once you have done this, it should work with ArgoCD. I have not used it myself, but if you're running a version that's newer, that version 3.0, the Azure Entra ID single sign-on should work. To help you, I also provided all these config maps as a YAML file, so you just can compare what config you have and what config I have, and this should help you to just update it. Before I end the video, let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and let's take a quick look at these two YAML files. Here in Visual Studio Code, I named the files the same name as the config maps. So in this case, ArgoCD RBAC CM. Here you can see the entire config map. As I said before, you have to add this policy.csv section. And I also added placeholder. So for example, here you have to provide the email address of the user or the group ID of the group that should be the admin. But you can also update whatever permissions you want to give. The second file is the ArgoCD CM. Here I also added the placeholder. So for the first one, the OIDC config, we have here the tenant ID and the client ID of the app registration. If we scroll down almost all the way to the bottom, we can see here the URL, and there you have to add the URL to your ArgoCD server. Depending on what version you're running, the config map might look a bit different, but you have to add these two sections. This brings us to the end of today's video. As we have seen, adding single sign-on with Entra to ArgoCD is actually quite simple. So first, we added the ArgoCD AKS extension just to have ArgoCD running. Don't focus on ArgoCD too much. Then we switched over to the Azure portal. We added a new app registration. We added some information like our public IP address. We added credentials and the users. Then we configured ArgoCD. There we entered information like, again, our public IP address, our tenant ID, and the ID of the app registration. But we also added an admin user. After we deployed this, we were able to log in with both users. The first user had only read-only access. Therefore, the user couldn't create any applications. But then the admin user were able to deploy a new application, and they should be able to do anything they want. At the end, I showed you also all the steps you have to do if you are using ArgoCD without the AKS extension. And with this, you should be able to replicate the behavior and also enable single sign-on for ArgoCD. What's important is that you need ArgoCD with the version 3 or newer, otherwise the feature won't work. But I think if you're running ArgoCD already, it should be quite easy for you to implement it. With this, that's everything I wanted to show you today. I hope it was interesting and you could learn something. Let me know in the comments what you think of the video. If you have any questions, if you want a follow-up to do it with ArgoCD itself, or if you want to look into another topic. And otherwise, I will see you next week with a new video.